Good morning, faithful listeners. You have tuned in to the P40 Ministries podcast, the one place where you can get a daily explanatory Bible reading to start your day strong. This is your host, Jen, bringing you a brand new episode out of Matthew. Hey there, friends and faithful listeners. You are listening to the P40 Ministries podcast with your host, Jen. I'm actually going to jump right in reading today. Unfortunately, I don't have a large amount of time to really discuss a lot today, so it'll be a quicker episode today. But we will be reading Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 14. And this section of the Bible is all about the Sabbath. Now, if you aren't sure what the Sabbath means, the Sabbath is basically what we consider nowadays to be a Sunday. But in Old Testament law, the Sabbath was a day that God had basically ordained to be a day of rest. So it was a day that you weren't supposed to do any work, you were supposed to rest, you were supposed to enjoy your time off from your daily work. It was a time for the people. Basically, God had made it so that people wouldn't burn themselves out. But of course, everything has to be complicated all the time. It can't just be a black and white issue. But we are talking about the Sabbath today. And back then, a Sabbath would have been on a Saturday. So let's discuss verses 1 through 14. I will be reading out of the NLT version of the Bible. So grab your cup of coffee and let's go ahead and start reading. At about that time, Jesus was walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, so they began breaking off some heads of grain and eating them. But some Pharisees saw them do it and protested, "Look, your disciples are breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath." Jesus said to them, "Haven't you read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God, and he and his companions broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. And haven't you read in the law of Moses that the priests on duty in the temple may work on the Sabbath? I tell you, there is one here who is even greater than the temple. But you would not have condemned my innocent disciples if you knew the meaning of this scripture. I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. For the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath." Then Jesus went over to their synagogue, where he noticed a man with a deformed hand. The Pharisees asked Jesus, "Does the law permit a person to work by healing on the Sabbath?" They were hoping he would say yes, so they could bring charges against him. And he answered, "If you had a sheep that fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you work to pull it out? Of course you would. And how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Yes, the law permits a person to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored, just like the other one. Then the Pharisees called a meeting to plot how to kill Jesus. You can see now why everything has to be complicated, because the priests took what God had given people for good, which was the Sabbath day of rest, and they had made it worse. They made it a day of absolutely ridiculous laws and rules and all sorts of stuff. I was actually reading somewhere that the Pharisees said that a person couldn't carry something in their hands, but rather they would have to find a different way to carry it, either on their garments or in their ears or with their elbows, like all sorts of really strange, ridiculous rules that people had to follow on the Sabbath that were never in the law of God. Basically, the law of God, when he gave people the Sabbath day, he said, don't do any work on the Sabbath. Prepare everything beforehand so you could have a day to just relax. And so when the Pharisees and the leading priests and the scribes and everything practiced the Sabbath, they forced these horrible rules and laws on other people as well, so that these people couldn't even enjoy their day off without being afraid of being seen by the Pharisees doing something that they might not consider correct for the Sabbath. So now, Jesus in verse 1 and his disciples are walking through this grain field, and they start pulling off some of the heads of the grain and eating them. Now, this was not considered stealing. This was actually in the law, in Deuteronomy, where God says that if a traveler is traveling through your field of grain or whatever else, they are allowed to pick off some of the vegetables or the grains or the corn or whatever else, and they're allowed to eat them. Now, you weren't allowed, of course, to harvest your neighbor's grain field, but it was permitted for people to walk through and eat if they were hungry, especially if they were travelers or they were poor or something along those lines. So this was not stealing. This was normal, and the person who owned this grain field would have expected this. And that's not why the priests are angry. They know this about the law. They don't think that Jesus and his disciples are stealing. They just are upset because they're picking off these heads of grain on the Sabbath day. And back then, because of the priests and the Pharisees and the teachers of the religious law, the Sabbath was almost a day that was so superstitious that people couldn't do anything on this day. It was the most superstitious day ever, and absolutely ridiculously legalistic. I think I talked a little bit about that word a couple days ago. But legalistic is basically an extreme adherence to a law or a formula. And that is what these Pharisees were forcing on these people at this time. So now Jesus, after the Pharisees accused them of working on the Sabbath, Jesus says, "Haven't you read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God, and he and his companions broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat." And so Jesus mentions this part of the Bible, this history of the Bible, when David, King David, who was revered by the Pharisees at the time, he was revered, and he went in and broke the law on probably the Sabbath. That's not exactly clear if David broke the law on the Sabbath or not. But one way or the other, David broke the law. It had everything to do with eating. And so Jesus brings this to their attention, and he's like, you revere David, who broke the law by doing something that he should never have done. And he said, you revere that person. You guys are the ones who work in the temple on the Sabbath. And he says in verse 5, haven't you read the law of Moses that the priests on duty in the temple may work on the Sabbath? So he's like, you guys work on the Sabbath. And then Jesus goes on to say in verse 7 that you priests would not have condemned my innocent disciples. If you knew the meaning of this scripture, I want you to show mercy and not offer sacrifices. And we talked about this before. Jesus had already mentioned this verse to these Pharisees. This is Hosea 6, verse 6, where God is saying that he would rather people were loving towards each other and merciful towards each other than offering him sacrifices, which was the culturally appropriate thing to do at this time. And, these sacrifices and these elaborate gifts that these priests would give to God meant nothing because they weren't loving towards other people, and they were so legalistic, and they were forcing these horrible laws on everybody. So Jesus quotes this verse again to them, and I think he also quoted it to them in, I think it might have been Matthew chapter 8 or 9, when the Pharisees got angry at Jesus for eating with the tax collectors and sinners. But he once again quotes this at them, and he says, you would not have condemned my innocent disciples for doing absolutely nothing here. They're not working on the Sabbath. They're just plucking little heads of grain off because they're hungry, and they're allowed to do that. And he says, you don't know the scriptures. You don't know the law and the prophets. Actually, you only want it for the religious aspect, but you don't actually want a relationship with God. And that's what Jesus is saying here. Now, one thing I was thinking about in verse 8, it says, for the Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath. And what that means is Jesus is saying that you no longer have to do this ritualistic, ridiculous chore of following the Sabbath law in order to get into heaven. because that's what these people were doing. They were doing it in order to gain their eternity in a sense. But Jesus is saying, you're not going to get eternity. You're not going to get salvation from following a superstition of the Sabbath. The only way you're going to gain salvation is through trust in Jesus, the Messiah, who came to save the world. And now, finally, after this, Jesus goes over to their synagogue. And this could have been a couple weeks later, it doesn't say, but he goes over to their synagogue and he notices a man with a deformed hand in the synagogue. So the Pharisees know that Jesus is going to heal this man, but before Jesus does anything, they come up to him and they're trying to trick him. And they say, does the law permit a person to work by healing on the Sabbath? And it says right after this, they were hoping he would say yes so they could bring charges against him. They didn't like Jesus. They wanted something to be done about him. And like I said, working on the Sabbath was considered a great sin and was something that was wrong. And yes, God had said, don't work on the Sabbath. But like I said, it was just so legalistic and so ridiculous and so superstitious the way it should not have been. And so Jesus says, it's hilarious. I can just imagine the snark in what Jesus is saying here. He's like, if you had a sheep that fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you work to pull it out? Of course you would. And then verse 12, how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Yes, the law does permit a person to do good on the Sabbath. Like I can just imagine Jesus just being so snarky to these priests and just saying this to them because it's true. You're allowed to do good on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a day for honoring God, remembering him, and that he took a break when he created the world, and then the seventh day he rested. But Jesus says, yes, the law permits a person to do good on the Sabbath. He's probably so irritated at this point. And so he tells this man with the deformed hand, he's like, hold out your hand. So the man holds out his hand, and it says it was restored just like the other one. So now it says in verse 14 that in their jealousy and anger, the Pharisees call a meeting to plot how to kill Jesus because they were mad that he kept showing them up and saying that they were not actually that smart and didn't know the law and the prophets, which was the truth. But they don't like to hear the truth because people who don't have the truth don't want to hear it. So friends, thank you so much for tuning in this morning and listening to this chapter on the Sabbath. Now, Matthew chapter 12 is a bit of a long chapter, so we won't finish it immediately, but maybe in a couple days or so, maybe next Thursday or next Tuesday possibly. Guys, I hope you had a really fantastic New Year's. Now, don't forget, even though New Year's and Christmas are over with, my store is still open, and it is a fantastic way if you enjoy the P40 Ministries podcast and everything that I'm doing here. It's a fantastic way to support P40 Ministries financially. Go take a look at the store and all the awesome t-shirt designs that I have and pick one out for yourself or for a family member. And I have some new ones coming in that are Valentine's themed, so definitely take a look at those. And I will put a link to that in my bio if you do want to check out the store, and I encourage you to look at it. But thank you guys so much once again for tuning in. I appreciate all of you. I want to ask that you join me tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. for another episode in Genesis. Now, I have noticed something, and I've talked about this in my Genesis podcast before. I have noticed that my New Testament episodes get significantly more downloads than my Old Testament episodes. But the Old Testament is important to listen to as well. And I think the reason that a lot of people don't necessarily want to listen to the Old Testament is because they believe that it no longer applies to them. But it does. The Bible is a book, and it starts at Genesis and ends at Revelation. And everything in there is an important thing to learn. And you have to read the Old Testament to really understand why Jesus had to come. So that is why I definitely encourage everybody to tune in tomorrow for the Genesis podcast episode that I'm going to be doing and maybe learn something out of there as well. So that will be 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. But friends, I've got nothing else to say. I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your week. Happy listening, and God bless.